The grand lecture hall was a cathedral of intellect. Rows of polished oak benches, walls lined with portraits of stoic men in academic gowns, and a faint scent of old paper and ambition. Dr. Leonard Holstrom, the celebrated archaeologist, stood at the podium, his voice carrying an authority that made the room hang on his every word. He was midway through explaining the significance of a newly uncovered inscription from a remote dig site when his eyes narrowed toward the back of the room. There, leaning quietly against the far wall, stood Lillian Carter, the janitor. She held a broom in one hand, the other resting on the handle of her cleaning cart. Her uniform, faded at the seams, was in stark contrast to the tailored suits and dresses worn by the professors and students. She wasn't making a sound, but Dr. Hallstrom's frown deepened as if her mere presence were a disruption. "Ma'am," he said, his voice cutting sharply through the scholarly air, "this is a closed lecture. Maintenance staff can tend to their duties afterward." The words didn't just dismiss her, they cut, publicly stripping her of dignity. A few students chuckled under their breath. Lillian's fingers tightened around the broom handle, but she said nothing. Instead, her eyes flickered to the projector screen. Displayed there was the reason for the entire lecture. A high-resolution image of a weathered stone tablet, its surface etched with intricate, looping symbols that gleamed faintly under the dig site's lighting. The caption beneath read, "Undeciphered script, circa 1st century BCE." Lillian's heart gave an almost imperceptible leap. She recognized something, not the whole code, but a pattern. 2 repeated symbols separated by a diagonal slash. An arrangement she had seen once before in a tattered book from her childhood. She hadn't thought of that book in years, but the memory was as clear as if she'd just turned its fragile pages yesterday. Dr. Hallstrom continued his lecture, his words swelling with self-importance. For decades, experts have been unable to decipher this inscription. We believe it may contain a dedication, possibly a name, but the language's origin remains elusive. From her corner, Lillian could almost hear the letters speaking to her. Not literally, but in the way familiar patterns emerge from chaos if you've stared at them long enough. The professor saw mystery and impossibility. She saw a puzzle with loose threads waiting to be pulled. The insult still burned, but it was tempered by a spark of curiosity, one that pushed aside the humiliation just enough to keep her rooted in place. She didn't leave the hall, not immediately. Instead, she lingered at the doorway, waiting until Dr. Hallstrom turned his back to adjust the slide. She studied the tablet's image intently, committing the sequence to memory. The slashes, the spirals, the diamond-shaped glyph that seemed to anchor the entire row. She mouthed silent sounds, matching them with ancient syllables she'd taught herself in secret over the years. It wasn't arrogance that made her think she could solve it. It was something quieter, deeper. The certainty that the world underestimated her simply because she wore the wrong uniform. When the lecture ended, the crowd shuffled out, heads buzzing with academic speculation. Lillian wheeled her cart inside, pretending to busy herself with collecting discarded coffee cups. Her gaze found the discarded printout of the slide resting on the edge of the podium. She picked it up, slipped it into the side pocket of her cart, and kept moving. She had no plan yet, no permission to be involved, and certainly no expectation that anyone would listen. But the code had already taken root in her mind, like a stubborn vine curling through cracks in stone. If you're enjoying this story of justice and hidden strength, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to find out how a simple act of prejudice turned into the most valuable lesson of Dr. Leonard Hallstrom's life. That night, as she locked the storage closet and prepared to leave, her thoughts weren't on the insult. They were on those symbols and on the feeling that she was standing at the edge of something far bigger than herself. Lillian Carter's life had been built on the quiet kind of resilience that rarely drew applause. Born in a small Georgia town where the library doubled as both sanctuary and escape, she had grown up with a mother who worked double shifts at the diner and a father who left before she learned long division. By the age of 9, she had discovered her favorite corner of the world, a dusty reading room on the second floor of the town library, where the air was warm with the smell of paper and glue. It was there she stumbled across a brittle, leather-bound volume buried between encyclopedias nobody touched. It wasn't catalogued properly, had no barcode, and its title was in an alphabet she didn't recognize. The librarian at the time, a silver-haired woman with sharp eyes, told her it was likely a donated oddity, probably Greek or something like that. Lillian wasn't sure, but she was hooked. She began tracing the strange symbols into her school notebooks, copying them the way other kids practiced their signatures. She didn't know then that she was looking at an obscure form of proto-Italic script used in merchant ledgers over 2,000 years ago. She only knew the characters spoke to her in a visual rhythm she wanted to understand. By high school, she'd quietly taught herself the basics of half a dozen ancient writing systems, Phoenician, early Latin, even a smattering of Etruscan. While other kids were memorizing prom dates and football stats, Lillian was poring over reproduction scrolls from yard sales and jotting phonetic equivalents in the margins. Her teachers thought she had an unusual hobby, but no one took it seriously. Then came the rupture. Her mother fell ill, and every plan Lillian had for college evaporated in the fluorescent hum of hospital corridors. The scholarships she'd lined up went to waste as she picked up cleaning work to keep the bills paid. The dream of becoming a linguist didn't die in one day. It just slipped into the background, quiet and persistent, like a melody she could hum but never perform. Years later, pushing her cart through the echoing halls of a university she could never afford, Lillian still carried that melody. She cleaned professors' offices littered with artifacts and notes, pausing only long enough to glance at a fragment of pottery or an open book before getting back to work. She never dared linger too long. The line between curiosity and trespassing was thin for someone in her position. But the symbols on that tablet slide in Dr. Hallstrom's lecture had been like a sudden chord that matched her long-forgotten tune. She could still see them in her mind now, even as she sat in the cramped break room, sipping coffee from a paper cup. She scribbled them onto the back of a napkin from memory, each stroke steady despite the tremor of adrenaline in her fingers. She recognized parts of them, not full words, but clusters. The repeated slash marks reminded her of a counting system she'd once studied from ancient Sardinian trade records. The diamond-shaped glyph was rarer, appearing only in ceremonial inscriptions connected to royal decrees, and the way the symbols were arranged wasn't random. It had a cadence, like a sentence in a language that hadn't been spoken aloud in millennia. The more she stared at her napkin sketch, the more the years between the library reading room and this break room dissolved. She felt the same hunger to know, the same quiet certainty that meaning was within reach if she could just hold the pieces together long enough. She didn't tell anyone. Experience had taught her that revealing too much about what she knew could lead to awkward smiles, polite disbelief, or worse, the suspicion that she was overstepping. But deep inside, a decision was forming. The janitor who'd been told to leave a lecture might return to that hall again, not with a broom, but with an answer. 2 days later, the university buzzed with anticipation for the follow-up session of Dr. Hallström's lecture series. The first talk had drawn an impressive crowd. The second promised the unveiling of new site photographs and speculative theories from the excavation team. Lillian had no reason to be there, not officially, but the route her nightly cleaning took conveniently past the lecture hall just before the doors closed. She moved slowly, pushing her cart with deliberate care, letting the chatter from inside spill into the hallway. Through the crack in the door, she could see the projector flicker to life, casting another image of the stone tablet onto the screen. This time, the photograph was sharper, taken after additional cleaning at the dig site. The grooves of the inscriptions were clearer, and faint red pigment clung stubbornly to certain symbols. Hallström cleared his throat and gestured toward the projected image. As you can see, despite advancements in imaging and linguistic analysis, and the inscription remains stubbornly resistant to translation. Various scholars have proposed theories: trade agreement, dedication to a deity, or perhaps even an early form of poetry. But consensus remains elusive. Lillian's eyes locked on the tablet's right-hand corner. There it was again, the same pairing of the diagonal slashes and the diamond glyph, now even more distinct. The pigment confirmed something she'd suspected. Those marks weren't random fillers. In ancient Sardinian scripts, the red pigment had often denoted proper names or titles. A ripple of excitement surged through her, though she kept her expression calm. In her mind, the symbols began to shift, rearranging into phonetic sounds she'd once memorized in a library far from here. The repetition, the placement, the subtle flourishes. They pointed toward a structure she recognized, a dedication formula used in ceremonial inscriptions to honor a ruler or benefactor. Hallström continued, "We've enlisted computational linguists, cryptographers, and even pattern recognition software, yet the puzzle persists. Perhaps in time, a breakthrough will occur." The room chuckled politely at his half-joke. But Lillian didn't join them. Her mind wasn't on the professor's tone. It was on the silent insistence of the code calling to her. She was beginning to see more than fragments now. A curved symbol she'd dismissed earlier suddenly clicked into place as a phonetic complement, a sound marker that clarified the word boundaries. It wasn't the entire translation, or not yet, but it was enough to form the skeleton of a name. And if she was right, that name wasn't just anyone's. It belonged to a figure whose reign had been dismissed by many historians as little more than myth. The lecture moved on to other topics, but Lillian had already tuned out. She was mapping the rest of the inscription in her mind, noting the placement of each glyph as if arranging a puzzle in the air. She would need references, more than the tattered scraps of memory could provide. After the lecture ended and the audience filed out, she lingered in the shadows, waiting for the last voices to fade. She stepped inside, her eyes on the podium, where a printout of the tablet photo lay abandoned. In one swift, deliberate motion, she slid it under the folded cleaning rag on her cart. As she wheeled the cart away, she passed Hallström, speaking to a colleague in the hallway. He didn't even glance at her. That suited her fine. Let him ignore her now. By the time she reached the service elevator, her mind was already racing ahead, to the library archives, to the restricted shelves she knew how to access after hours, to the dusty reference books no one had opened in years. Somewhere in those stacks was the missing piece, and she was going to find it. The university library after midnight was another world entirely. The chatter of students, the squeak of sneakers on tile, the hum of computers, all gone. In their place was the thick, almost sacred stillness that Lillian loved most. It was a silence that belonged to the books, as if every shelf were holding its breath. She pushed her cart inside under the guise of after-hours cleaning. though the mop bucket sat untouched. Her real mission lay 3 flights up, in a section rarely visited even during the day, the Special Collections Room. The door's keycard scanner might have stopped most people, but Lillian had spent enough years here to know its weaknesses. When Professor Ames, the head archivist, had accidentally locked himself out one afternoon, she had been the one to fetch the backup key from facilities. She'd noticed then that the lock was mechanical, an old brass cylinder that could be opened with the same master key used for the adjacent maintenance closets. The professors never suspected she knew. She slipped inside, closing the door quietly behind her. The air was cooler here, smelling faintly of leather and dust. Narrow aisles led between glass-fronted cabinets, each labelled in tidy calligraphy. Epigraphy, paleography, numismatics. She headed straight for a low cabinet on the far wall, her fingers trembling slightly as she flipped through the worn reference volumes on ancient Mediterranean scripts. These weren't casual reading. Each was dense with grainy photographs, translation tables, and academic annotations. She'd skimmed many of them over the years while dusting, absorbing their logic like a language she was destined to speak. Pulling a heavy tome onto the nearest desk, she flipped to the index and traced her finger down the entries until she found the one she was looking for. Ceremonial Dedications, Sardinian Royal Inscriptions, 3rd–1st century BCE. Her pulse quickened. The example shown was shockingly similar to the fragment from the lecture slide. The same diamond glyph, the same slash marks denoting honorifics. And there, in a footnote, the red pigment was explained in detail, used exclusively in contexts where the inscription named a ruler of divine descent. She spread out her napkin sketch and the stolen printout side by side. Piece by piece, she began cross-referencing symbols with the tables in the book. Some matched perfectly. Others required flipping to supplemental charts in a different volume. Her pencil flew across the page, jotting provisional phonetic sounds, rearranging them, scratching out and rewriting. Hours passed without her noticing. The library clock ticked away the night as she sank deeper into the puzzle. Occasionally, she whispered the sounds under her breath, listening for a cadence that matched the patterns described in the text. It was close, so close she could taste it. But one section of the inscription stubbornly resisted her. The final cluster of symbols didn't align with any known lexicon. It was either a lost word or a name omitted from existing records. She leaned back, rubbing her temples. Somewhere in her memory, there was a ghost of recognition, something she had read years ago in that long-lost library book as a child. It hovered just out of reach, like a word on the tip of her tongue. Then she remembered, not the word itself, but the story attached to it. A Sardinian queen whose reign had been doubted, her name preserved only in fragments found far from the island. Historians had dismissed it as a translation error, a misattribution. But what if it wasn't? The idea hit her with such force that she had to steady her breathing. If she was right, the inscription didn't just name this queen, it commemorated her in a way that tied her to the larger Mediterranean power network of her era. That would rewrite a chapter of history. She glanced at the clock. Dawn was only a couple of hours away. Carefully, she slid the books back into place, tucked her notes into the deep pocket of her apron, and slipped out of the room, locking the door behind her. She would return tomorrow night to finish the work. And when she did, she wouldn't just have a theory, she would have proof. The following evening, the library was alive with a quiet tension Lillian hadn't anticipated. Word had spread that Dr. Hallstrom was entertaining a small circle of visiting scholars from Europe. and the special collections room had been reserved for their use. She didn't need to check the schedule to know. The hum of hushed, important voices carried down the marble hallway like an approaching storm. She had no intention of colliding with them, but fate has a way of ignoring intentions. As she rounded the corner with her cart, the group emerged from the room. Hallström's sharp eyes caught her instantly. "You," he said, his tone balanced somewhere between recognition and irritation. "The custodian, isn't it?" Lillian paused, her hands resting lightly on the cart's handle. "Yes, sir," she replied evenly. He studied her for a moment, then smirked faintly. "I hear you've taken an unusual interest in our tablet." The way he said "our" left no doubt he considered ownership to extend far beyond the artifact itself. One of the European scholars, a wiry man with wire-rimmed glasses, chuckled. "Did she now? Perhaps she'll crack the mystery the rest of us could not." His words dripped with the kind of amusement reserved for impossible hypotheticals. Something in Lillian's spine straightened. "Maybe I could," she said, before she could stop herself. The group laughed softly, but Hallström's smirk didn't fade. Instead, he tilted his head. "Tell you what," he said, "if you think you can do better than the computational linguists, why don't you present your findings to us tomorrow? Open forum. The academic board will be there." It was not an invitation. It was a challenge, wrapped in condescension, baited with the expectation of her failure. She knew it. He knew it. Her heartbeat was steady, though. "Fine," she said. "I'll be there." For a moment, a flicker of surprise crossed his face before the smirk returned. "Excellent. We'll see if your mop and bucket come with a degree in epigraphy." The group moved past her, their laughter fading into the corridor. Lillian stood still for a beat, gripping the cart's handle until the ridges bit into her palms. The stakes had just escalated far beyond quiet midnight research. This wasn't about curiosity anymore. It was about proving she had the right to stand in the same room as the people who had dismissed her. That night, she didn't go home after her shift. She returned to the special collections room, locking the door behind her, and spread her notes across the desk. Every second until the presentation counted now. She reviewed her phonetic mappings, cross-checked them with 3 separate academic sources, and confirmed the ceremonial structure of the inscription. The last cluster of symbols, the Queen's name, was still unverified, but the pieces surrounding it were solid enough to build her case. In the silence of the library, she practiced how she would explain it. Not defensively, not apologetically, but with the same matter-of-fact authority the scholars used. She imagined their skeptical faces shifting as the logic unfolded. When dawn's first light touched the high windows, she packed up her notes and tucked the printout of the tablet into her bag. Her exhaustion was tempered by a strange, exhilarating calm. Tomorrow she wouldn't be the janitor standing awkwardly at the back of the hall. Tomorrow she'd stand in front of them all, Hallström included, and force them to see her for who she truly was. The lecture hall was smaller than the grand auditorium, but no less imposing. A semicircle of high-backed chairs formed the front row, occupied by professors in tailored suits, visiting scholars with notepads poised, and Dr. Hallström himself, seated dead center like a judge at a tribunal. Behind them, rows of graduate students leaned forward with the eager, almost predatory anticipation of those expecting a spectacle. Lillian stood at the podium, a printout of the tablet in one hand and her neatly organized notes in the other. The hum of whispered side comments drifted from the front row, too soft to catch every word, but the tone was unmistakable: amusement, doubt, perhaps a little pity. "Miss Carter," Hallström began, his voice smooth and faintly mocking, "you may proceed." She laid the printout on the projector platform, letting the image fill the screen behind her. "This is the inscription you've all seen before," she said evenly. "What you haven't seen is the pattern that runs through it." Her fingers moved to the first cluster of symbols. The paired slashes here and here, they're not decorative. In ancient Sardinian ceremonial inscriptions, these marks indicated honorific titles. The red pigment, still visible in the grooves, was reserved for individuals of high rank or divine lineage. She clicked to the next slide, a comparative image from her reference research. A low murmur rippled through the room as the similarity became clear. "The diamond-shaped glyph," she continued, "isn't an abstract symbol. It's a phonetic logogram tied to the concept of rulership. When paired with the preceding honorific marks, it forms the structural backbone of a dedication, one that names a sovereign." She could feel the tension shifting. The mocking expressions in the front row were less certain now, though Hallström's face remained impassive. She advanced to the final cluster of symbols, the ones that had resisted her until last night. "This section," she said, "does not appear in any known Sardinian lexicon. That's because it's not Sardinian, it's a loan word, imported from an older Phoenician dialect, used here as a proper name. That name," she paused, letting the silence stretch, "is Theoria." The reaction was immediate. Several scholars exchanged startled looks. One of the European visitors leaned forward sharply, pen frozen over his notebook. "Theoria," Lillian went on, "was a queen mentioned only in passing in a handful of disputed maritime records. Her existence has been debated for centuries, dismissed by many as a mistranslation or legend. But this inscription is not only a dedication to her, it situates her within a network of alliances that would have extended Sardinia's influence across the central Mediterranean." The room was utterly still now. Even the students had stopped whispering. "I believe this tablet commemorates the completion of a royal harbour project under her reign," Lillian concluded, "which would make it one of the earliest surviving records of a female ruler in this region, and proof that she was far more than a myth." She stepped back from the podium, heart pounding, but hands steady. For a moment, no one moved. Then the wiry European scholar who'd mocked her the day before spoke, his voice low and almost reverent. "If she's right, this changes everything." All eyes turned to Hallström. He stared at the screen for a long moment before looking at Lillian. His voice, when it came, was quieter than she expected. "Can you show us your source comparisons?" She nodded, moving to the projector again. For the next 20 minutes, she answered questions, displayed cross-references, and defended her methodology with a clarity that surprised even her. Not once did she stumble. By the end, the room was no longer looking at a janitor. They were looking at the woman who had just solved a mystery that had eluded them for decades. When the last slide faded from the screen, the room held a silence more profound than applause. It was the silence of recalibration, the moment when minds shift to accommodate a new truth. Lillian stood still at the podium, letting it settle. Hallström broke it first. He rose slowly from his seat, his expression carefully schooled, but no longer unreadable. "Miss Carter," he began, his voice carrying across the room, "your work is remarkable." He hesitated, the pause itself an admission. "I owe you an apology. I underestimated you, publicly." He didn't look away as he said it, and for the first time since she'd met him, there was no trace of condescension in his tone. The acknowledgement was plain, almost raw. A ripple of murmured agreement passed through the other scholars. The wiry European who had laughed at her the day before cleared his throat. "If you'd be willing, I'd like to collaborate on a paper. This discovery deserves proper documentation and proper credit." Lillian inclined her head, not yet trusting herself to speak. Holstrom continued, "In fact, the excavation team will need someone with your linguistic insight. I'd like to offer you a place on the research team, effective immediately." It was more than she had imagined, and yet she didn't let her surprise show. "I'd be honored," she said simply. The graduate students began whispering again, but this time the tone had shifted. Some looked at her with admiration, others with the calculating interest reserved for someone suddenly worth knowing. After the meeting dispersed, Hallstrom approached her privately. "For what it's worth," he said, "most of us spend our entire careers hoping for a moment like the one you just had. Don't waste it." She met his gaze steadily. "I don't plan to." As she left the hall, the weight of the past week settled over her. The insult in the lecture hall, the stolen printout, the long nights in the library. They had all led to this turning point. The janitor who had been told to leave had not only stayed, she had changed the conversation entirely. And now, with a seat at the table, she intended to keep changing it. That night, she walked through the quiet campus under a sky streaked with the last light of sunset, the folder of her notes pressed to her chest. Somewhere, far from here, the harbour Queen Thuraya had built still lay buried beneath the sea. Lillian knew she would stand there some day, not as an intruder, but as the one who brought her story back to life. 3 months later, the harbour at Cala di Luna was alive again, not with merchants and sailors, as it had been in Queen Thuraya's day, but with archaeologists, divers and surveyors. Tents dotted the rocky shoreline, and the rhythmic hiss of air compressors mixed with the cry of gulls overhead. Lillian stood on the edge of the pier, the early morning sun warming her face. Below her, the water shimmered a deep, impossible blue. Somewhere beneath those waves lay the remnants of the Queen's harbour works, preserved in silt and stone for over 2,000 years. She was no longer wearing the faded janitor's uniform. The wind tugged at the field jacket issued to her as part of the research team, its chest pocket bearing the stitched crest of the university. Around her neck hung a waterproof notebook, already filled with notes and sketches from the previous weeks. The dig had confirmed her theory almost immediately. Divers brought up carved blocks bearing the same honorific slashes and diamond glyphs she'd identified, along with fragments of mooring posts arranged in a pattern that matched ancient port designs. Even the skeptical scholars now spoke of Thuraya's reign as fact. Hallstrom himself had been transformed in his manner toward her. He consulted her regularly, deferred to her judgment on linguistic matters, and, perhaps most tellingly, introduced her to visitors not as Miss Carter, but as our epigraphic specialist. It was not friendship, not yet, but it was respect, hard won. One evening, after a long day cataloguing artifacts, she sat by the shore with the wiry European scholar, Dr. Müller. He handed her a steaming cup of coffee and said quietly, "You know what you did? Most people in your position would never have tried. Too much risk of humiliation." She smiled faintly. "I've been underestimated my whole life. If I let that stop me, I'd still be pushing a mop outside your lecture." He chuckled, shaking his head. "I think Queen Thuraya would have liked you." Weeks later, as the team prepared to publish their joint paper, Lillian returned briefly to the university to collect a few personal belongings she'd left behind. Walking through the familiar halls, she passed the lecture room where it had all started. It was empty now, dust motes drifting in the sunlight. She paused at the doorway, remembering the sting of Hallstrom's voice telling her to leave, and the defiant spark that had kept her rooted there. That spark had carried her across a threshold she hadn't even known she was standing on. In the months since, she had learned something far more valuable than any translation, that knowledge has no uniform, and brilliance doesn't ask permission. The world would always have those quick to judge, quick to exclude. But it also had moments where persistence cracked the shell of prejudice wide open. She stepped into the empty lecture hall, placed her palm on the podium for a moment, then turned and walked away without looking back. If this story touched you, subscribe to the channel to discover more stories about how extraordinary people turn humiliation into triumph.